the sleepy village of Upper Chipping, a mysterious stranger from Lisbon arrives, clutching a locked leather case that hides dark secrets. When a maid is found strangled with a silk scarf, Miss Jane Marple's sharp eyes unravel a web of art smuggling, blackmail, and murder. As whispers of deceit swirl, can she unmask the killer before they vanish into the shadows? A chilling Agatha Christie-style mystery unfolds. Chapter 1. The arrival at Upper Chipping, the village of Upper Chipping, nestled in a gentle fold of the English countryside, was a place where time seemed to linger, reluctant to rush forward. Its thatched cottages, their gardens ablaze with autumnal hues, clustered around a green where geese waddled with proprietary ease. The church, with its weathered spire, stood sentinel, its bell marking the hours with a rhythm as steady as the seasons. On this particular October morning, a fine mist draped the village, softening the edges of the world. And it was through this veil that Miss Jane Marple, seated at her bow window with a skein of pale blue wool in her lap, observed the arrival of a stranger. Miss Marple, with her delicate frame and eyes that missed nothing, was a fixture in Upper Chipping, as much a part of its fabric as the ancient yew in the churchyard. Her cottage, modest but impeccably kept, afforded a clear view of the station platform, where the 10:15 train from London had just discharged its handful of passengers. Among them was a man who drew her attention at once. He was tall, with a lean, almost gaunt frame, his skin sallow in a way that suggested warmer climes than England's damp chill. His dark overcoat, too heavy for the mild weather, hung loosely, and a wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face. He carried a small leather case, its surface scuffed but locked with a brass clasp that gleamed faintly in the misty light. His gait was curious, hesitant, as though he were testing the ground beneath him, unaccustomed to its firmness. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she watched him pause, glance at a slip of paper, and then make his way towards the high street. The villagers, ever alert to newcomers, had already begun to whisper. By noon, when Miss Marple took her customary stroll to the post office, she heard the name, Senor Antonio Ferreira, and the word Lisbon murmured with the hushed excitement reserved for anything foreign. No one knew who had first supplied these details, but in Upper Chipping, facts had a way of sprouting from supposition. The stranger's destination, it soon emerged, was Chipping Manor, a grand but faded house on the village's edge. Its ivy-clad walls and tall chimneys spoke of a prouder past, but since Colonel Bantry's death 3 years prior, it had stood empty, its windows dark. Recently, however, it had been leased by Mrs. Lavinia Gray, a widow of uncertain age who had arrived a month ago with little fanfare. She was a woman of refined manners and few words. Her dark hair swept into an elegant chignon, her dresses simple yet costly. She claimed a desire for the peace of rural life, but Miss Marple, who understood the ways of those who sought solitude, suspected there was more to her story. People, she had often observed, rarely came to places like Upper Chipping without a reason. At the post office, Mrs. Weatherby, whose tongue was as sharp as her spectacles, was holding court. "He's Portuguese, they say," she declared, sorting letters with unnecessary vigour. "Went straight to the manor, bold as brass. And that Mrs. Gray, hardly a soul's seen her since she arrived. What's she hiding, I'd like to know." Miss Marple, purchasing stamps, offered a mild smile. "Perhaps she simply enjoys her own company," she suggested, but her mind was elsewhere, noting the coincidence of two newcomers in so short a time. That afternoon, Miss Marple called on her friend Mrs. Harmon at the vicarage, where tea was served with a side of village gossip. Mrs. Harmon, a cheerful woman with a knack for indiscretion, mentioned Senor Ferrera's arrival at the Blue Boar Inn, where he had taken a room. "He's polite enough," she said, passing a plate of scones. "But there's something about him. Those eyes, so watchful. And that case he carries never lets it out of his sight. What's in it, do you suppose?" Miss Marple, spreading a thin layer of jam, remarked only that people often carried their burdens with them, whether in cases or otherwise. Mrs. Harmon laughed, but Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the stranger's hesitant step and the locked case, which reminded her of a man she had once met in St. Mary Mead, whose secrets had been far from innocent. As the sun dipped below the hills, casting long shadows over Upper Chipping, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. From her window, she saw the lights of Chipping Manor flicker on, one by one, as though reluctant to reveal their secrets. She picked up her knitting, her needles moving with quiet precision, but her mind was far from idle. In Upper Chipping, as in all small places, the arrival of a stranger was like a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples would soon reach every shore. Chapter 2. The shadow of suspicion. The autumn sun rose over Upper Chipping with a clarity that sharpened every detail of the village, from the dew-glistened cobblestones to the golden leaves drifting lazily onto the green. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her garden with a cup of tea and a basket of mending, felt the pulse of the village quicken. Senor Antonio Ferrera, the stranger who had arrived from Lisbon only yesterday, was no longer merely a curiosity, but a catalyst, stirring the quiet waters of Upper Chipping into restless ripples. His presence, like a discordant note in a familiar tune, had set tongues wagging and suspicions simmering. Miss Marple, her delicate hands busy with a darned sock, observed the high street from her garden chair. The village, though small, was a microcosm of human nature, and she had long ago learned to read its signs. At the grocer's, Mrs. Price was seen whispering to the baker's wife, her gestures animated as she recounted Ferrera's morning visit to her shop. He had purchased only a loaf of bread and a tin of biscuits, paying with crisp notes that seemed too new for ordinary use. Foreign money, perhaps, Mrs. Price had said, though Miss Marple, overhearing this later at the post office, knew the notes were English enough. It was the man's manner, courteous yet guarded, his dark eyes scanning the shelves as though they held secrets rather than tinned peas, that fueled the gossip. Ferrera had taken a room at the Blue Boar Inn, a sturdy establishment with creaking floorboards, and a landlord, Mr. Higgs, who prided himself on knowing every guest's business. Yet Ferrera eluded even Mr. Higgs's scrutiny. He dined alone, his leather case, a small scuffed affair with a gleaming brass clasp, always at his side, as though it were an extension of his person. Miss Marple, passing the inn on her way to the church, noted him through the window. His long fingers tracing the edge of a newspaper he barely read. His face, sallow and lined, bore the look of a man who carried more than a traveller's fatigue. The village's curiosity was not confined to Ferrera alone. Chipping Manor, where Mrs. Lavinia Gray resided, had become a secondary focus of intrigue. Mrs. Gray, with her elegant poise and elusive past, had done little to endear herself to Upper Chipping. She attended Sunday service, but spoke to no one beyond polite nods, and her rare appearances in the village were marked by a reticence that bordered on aloofness. Her maid, Ellen, was even less forthcoming, a woman of middle age whose sharp features and silent demeanour suggested a life of unspoken grievances. Miss Marple, calling at the manor with a bunch of late-blooming roses as a neighbourly gesture, had been received with strained courtesy. Mrs. Gray's drawing-room was tasteful but impersonal, its furnishings betraying no hint of her history. Yet there, on a side table, was a leather case identical to Ferreira's, its presence as jarring as a misplaced note in a melody. "You've made the manor quite your own," Miss Marple had remarked, her eyes resting lightly on the case. Mrs. Gray's reply, "It suits my needs," was accompanied by a fleeting glance that betrayed unease. By noon the village was abuzz with fresh tales. Young Tommy Pierce, delivering chops to the vicarage, recounted a sighting that sent a shiver through the tea-drinking ladies gathered there. He had seen Ferreira, late the previous evening, standing near the manor's wrought-iron gate, sketching in a small notebook. The moonlight, Tommy claimed, had illuminated the page, revealing lines and shapes that looked like a plan of the manor's grounds. "Like something a spy would draw," he added, his voice trembling with excitement. Miss Marple, invited to the vicarage for a light luncheon, listened with her usual air of mild interest. Boys like Tommy, she knew, were given to exaggeration, but the kernel of truth in his story intrigued her. Plans and sketches, in her experience, were rarely innocent, particularly when drawn under cover of night. At the vicarage, Mrs. Harmon, the vicar's wife, was in her element, her round face flushed with the thrill of gossip. "He's not like us, that's certain," she said, pouring tea with a vigour that splashed the saucer. Mr. Giles tried to talk to him about the history of Upper Chipping, thinking to draw him out, but Ferreira just smiled and said he was here on private matters. Private matters indeed, and that case he carries. What's in it, I wonder? The other ladies, Mrs. Weatherby, Miss Hartnell, and the perpetually anxious Miss Simpkins, offered their theories, ranging from smuggled jewels to coded messages. Miss Marple, nibbling a cucumber sandwich, observed that people often guarded what they most feared to lose. Her comment, as usual, was met with nods but little comprehension, for the ladies of Upper Chipping were more accustomed to voicing suspicions than unravelling them. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple took her customary walk along the lanes, her stout shoes crunching on fallen leaves. The air was sharp with the scent of damp earth, and the distant hills were softened by a haze that promised rain. She paused near the manor's boundary, where a low stone wall marked the edge of its grounds. The gate, she noted, bore signs of recent use, scratches on the iron, a faint scuff of mud that was not native to the manor's well-kept paths. Her thoughts turned to Ferreira's nocturnal wanderings and Mrs. Gray's nervous demeanour. The two, she sensed, were connected, though the thread of their association remained elusive. That evening, as the village settled into its quiet routines, Miss Marple attended a meeting of the Women's Institute, where the topic of Ferreira dominated once more. Miss Hartnell, her voice sharp with indignation, reported seeing him at the post office, sending another telegram, this one, she claimed, in a language she couldn't read. Portuguese, likely, she said, as though the language itself were evidence of wrongdoing. Miss Marple, adjusting her shawl, remarked that telegrams were often sent in haste, and haste was a poor concealer of intent. Her words, as usual, floated past the assembly, but her mind was busy, piecing together the fragments of the day. As night fell, Upper Chipping grew still, the only sounds the distant hoot of an owl and the faint creak of shutters in the wind. Miss Marple, at her cottage window, saw a figure move along the lane toward the manor. A tall silhouette, hat pulled low, the leather case a dark shape against the moonlight. Ferreira, she thought, and her fingers paused on the lace she was crocheting. The village, she knew, was poised on the edge of something, a secret perhaps, or a scandal. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that strangers brought change, and change, in a place like Upper Chipping, was seldom without consequence. Chapter 3. The Inquest and the Clue. The morning after Senor Ferreira's moonlit wanderings, Upper Chipping awoke to a tragedy that sent a chill through its tranquil lanes. The news spread like wildfire. Ellen, Mrs. Gray's doer maid, had been found dead in the rose garden of Chipping Manor. Her body discovered at dawn by the gardener, Mr. Timms, who had been pruning the late blooms. A silk scarf, tightly knotted around her throat, told a grim tale of murder. By breakfast, the village was alive with whispers, and Miss Jane Marple, sipping her tea by the fire, sensed that the ripples caused by the stranger from Lisbon had become a torrent. The inquest, held 2 days later in the village hall, drew a crowd that filled the benches and spilled into the aisles. The hall, usually reserved for whist drives and flower shows, was transformed into a sombre arena, its walls adorned with faded photographs of past village fetes. Miss Marple, seated near the back with her knitting bag at her feet, observed the proceedings with her usual quiet attention. The coroner, Mr. Pendleton, a brisk man from the county town, conducted the inquiry with an air of detached efficiency, his spectacles glinting as he called witnesses. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, was the first to testify. A man of few words but much competence, he stated that Ellen had died by strangulation, the scarf, a delicate thing of pale blue silk, having been pulled with considerable force. The time of death, he estimated, was between 11 o'clock and midnight. There were no signs of a struggle, save for a faint bruise on her wrist, as though she had been grasped tightly before the end. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, noted the absence of defensive wounds, suggesting Ellen had known her assailant or been taken by surprise. Mrs. Lavinia Gray, pale but composed, took the stand next. The scarf, she confirmed, was hers, a gift from a friend abroad, but she claimed it had been missing for several days, likely stolen from her dressing table. Her voice, though steady, carried a brittleness that Miss Marple recognized as fear masquerading as grief. When questioned about Ellen's character, Mrs. Gray described her as loyal but reserved, with no known enemies. She kept to herself, Mrs. Gray said, her gloved hands clasped tightly. I can't imagine who would do such a thing. Miss Marple, watching closely, noted the way Mrs. Gray's eyes avoided the coroner's gaze, lingering instead on the hall's exit. Senor Ferreira was called next, and his appearance caused a stir among the villagers. He stood tall, his sallow face impassive, though his fingers tightened briefly on the leather case he carried. He stated he had been in his room at the Blue Boar Inn at the time of the murder, reading a book on English architecture. Mr. Higgs, the innkeeper, offered a half-hearted corroboration, admitting he had seen Ferreira retire upstairs, but could not swear he had remained there, as Mrs. Higgs had been tending a sick child, and the inn was quiet. The coroner pressed Ferreira on his purpose in Upper Chipping, to which he replied with a faint smile that he was exploring business opportunities. His vagueness drew murmurs from the crowd, but Miss Marple, her eyes narrowed, found his composure more telling than his words. The inquest concluded with an open verdict: murder by person or persons unknown. As the villagers dispersed, their whispers grew louder, weaving theories of jealousy, robbery, or foreign intrigue. Miss Marple, lingering in the hall, overheard young Tommy Pierce recounting his tale of Ferreira's moonlit sketching to a group of wide-eyed boys. She made a mental note to speak with him later, for boys, she knew, often saw what adults overlooked. Her own observation came as she passed the table where Ellen's belongings had been displayed for the inquest. Among them were her shoes, sturdy and practical, caked with mud that bore a reddish hue. Miss Marple paused, her mind sharpening. The Manor's rose garden, she knew, was composed of dark, loamy soil, free of clay. The red earth, however, was distinctive to the old quarry a mile beyond the village, a place long abandoned, but rumoured to be a haunt for poachers and vagrants. She filed this detail away, her thoughts turning to the leather cases, Ferreira's and Mrs. Gray's, and the secrets they might hold. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited her niece, Florence, who had arrived in Upper Chipping for a brief stay. Over tea in the cottage's cosy parlour, Florence, a practical woman with a taste for modern novels, dismissed the village's excitement as small-town hysterics. "A maid's been killed, Aunt Jane, and they're spinning tales of spies and smugglers. It's probably just a jealous lover or a thief." Miss Marple, pouring a second cup, smiled faintly. "People are rarely killed for simple reasons, my dear," she said. "The truth lies in the details they try to hide." Florence laughed, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, sifting through the morning's revelations. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting a pretext for observation. The village was quieter now, the shock of murder settling into a wary unease. She thought of Ellen's red clay shoes, Ferreira's evasive answers, and Mrs. Gray's stolen scarf. The pieces, she felt, were beginning to form a pattern, though its shape remained elusive. In Upper Chipping, as in all places where human nature held sway, the truth was often buried beneath layers of pretense, waiting for a patient hand to uncover it. Miss Marple, her needles moving with quiet precision, was nothing if not patient. Chapter 4. The Hidden Correspondence. The days following the due inquest cast a pall over Upper Chipping, where the usual rhythm of village life, morning milk deliveries, the chatter of the market square, was underscored by a hum of unease. Ellen's murder, unresolved and stark, hung over the village like a storm cloud, and the presence of Signor Antonio Ferreira, with his shadowed eyes and ever-present leather case, only deepened the sense of disquiet. Miss Jane Marple, however, found clarity in the village's turmoil, her mind as sharp as the needles that clicked steadily in her hands. She knew that secrets like weeds had a way of surfacing when least expected. On a crisp morning, with the scent of wood smoke lingering in the air, Miss Marple joined Mrs. Harmon at the vicarage to sort donations for the upcoming church fete. The task, a yearly ritual, involved sifting through boxes of cast-off books, linens and trinkets, a process Miss Marple found as revealing of human nature as any conversation. As she leafed through a stack of dusty novels, her fingers brushed against a folded paper tucked inside a worn copy of The Vicar of Wakefield. It was a letter, its edges torn, written in a precise, foreign hand. The ink was fresh, the words cryptic. "The shipment is secure. Lisbon's orders unchanged, await further instructions." The signature was a smudge, but the paper itself was thick, with a faint watermark that Miss Marple recognized from a scrap she had glimpsed in Ferreira's hand at the post office days earlier. She slipped the letter into her reticule, her expression as placid as ever, though her thoughts raced. The discovery sharpened her resolve. That afternoon, under the pretext of discussing fate arrangements, Miss Marple called on Mrs. Lavinia Gray at Chipping Manor. The manor's heavy oak door was opened by a temporary maid, a nervous girl from the village, who explained that Mrs. Gray was indisposed but would see her. The drawing-room, with its high ceilings and faded tapestries, felt colder than before, and Mrs. Gray herself seemed diminished, her elegant features drawn. She greeted Miss Marple with a forced smile, her hands fidgeting with a silver brooch. "You're very kind to call," she said, her voice thin. "This dreadful business with Ellen has quite unsettled me." Miss Marple, settling into a chair with her knitting, steered the conversation to neutral topics, the fate, the weather, before gently probing. "Poor Ellen," she murmured. "Such a quiet woman, yet I suppose she noticed things, living so close to you." Mrs. Gray's fingers stilled, and her eyes darted to the leather case on the side table, its brass clasp glinting in the firelight. "She was discreet," Mrs. Gray replied too quickly, "but curious, perhaps too curious, about my papers." The admission, though fleeting, was a crack in her polished facade, and Miss Marple noted it with care. As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple mentioned the old quarry, a casual remark about its wildflowers. Mrs. Gray's cup rattled in its saucer, and her voice, when she spoke, was sharp. "The quarry? I've no reason to go there. It's a desolate place." The denial was too emphatic, and Miss Marple, with a sympathetic nod, changed the subject, her mind cataloguing the moment. She left the manor with a clearer sense of Mrs. Gray's unease, and a suspicion that the quarry held more than wildflowers. Back in the village, gossip had taken a new turn. Mr. Giles, the historian, reported seeing Ferreira arguing with a stranger near the quarry. A man in a grey suit, broad-shouldered and hatless, who had vanished into the dusk before anyone could approach. The encounter, witnessed from a distance, was recounted with relish at the Blue Boar Inn, where theories of espionage and smuggling flourished. Miss Marple, hearing the tale from Mrs. Weatherby at the post office, considered the stranger's role. Was he a confederate, a rival, or something else entirely? The letter in her reticule suggested a network, and networks, she knew, were built on trust or fear. That evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fire, she reread the torn letter, its words a puzzle waiting to be solved. The reference to Lisbon's orders pointed to Ferreira, but Mrs. Gray's nervous reaction to the quarry hinted at a deeper connection. Ellen's death, Miss Marple suspected, was no random act, but a consequence of what she had seen or heard. The maid's curiosity, mentioned so carelessly by Mrs. Gray, suggested she had stumbled upon something dangerous, perhaps in the manor, perhaps at the quarry. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at her door. It was young Tommy Pierce, his cap askew, bearing a message from Mrs. Harmon about the fete. Seizing the opportunity, Miss Marple invited him in for a glass of lemonade, and gently drew out his story of Ferreira's sketching. "It was odd, miss," Tommy said, his eyes bright. "He was drawing the manor's walls, like he was measuring them, and he kept looking over his shoulder, as if someone was watching." Miss Marple, offering a biscuit, thanked him warmly, her mind turning over the image of a man mapping a house by night. It was not, she thought, the act of an innocent visitor. As Tommy left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles moving with their familiar rhythm. The village, she sensed, was a stage, and its players, Ferreira, Mrs. Gray, the mysterious stranger, were bound by a script she had yet to read. The letter, the quarry, the scarf, the sketches, each was a thread in a tapestry of deceit, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was determined to unravel it. In Upper Chipping, where secrets whispered in the shadows, the truth was never far from those who knew where to look. Chapter 5. The Quarry's Secret. The air in Upper Chipping grew heavier with each passing day, as though the village itself were holding its breath, waiting for the shadow of Ellen's murder to lift. Miss Jane Marple, however, was not one to wait idly. Her mind, sharp and restless beneath her gentle exterior, churned with the clues she had gathered. The cryptic letter, Mrs. Gray's unease, Senor Ferreira's nocturnal sketches, and the red clay on Ellen's shoes pointing to the old quarry. She sensed that the quarry, a place shunned by the villagers for its bleak desolation, held a key to the mystery, and she resolved to see it for herself. On a grey morning, with clouds piling high over the hills, Miss Marple enlisted young Tommy Pierce to guide her to the quarry. She framed the outing as a nature walk, promising to teach him about the wild herbs that grew among the rocks. Tommy, eager for any adventure, agreed readily, his pockets bulging with string and a slingshot. As they walked along the winding path, the village receding behind them, Miss Marple noted the boys' chatter, stories of rabbits and hidden caves, while her eyes scanned the ground for signs of recent passage. The path, rutted and overgrown, bore fresh footprints, too large for a boy's, and the faint impression of tire tracks, suggesting a vehicle had ventured where none should. The quarry itself was a stark contrast to Upper Chipping's pastoral charm. Its jagged walls, scarred by years of excavation, loomed over a flat expanse of red clay, dotted with tufts of grass and rusted machinery. A disused shed, its roof sagging, stood at the far end, half hidden by brambles. Miss Marple, leaning lightly on her stick, directed Tommy to explore the perimeter while she approached the shed. The door was ajar, its hinges creaking in the wind, and inside, beneath a tattered tarpaulin, she found a wooden crate. Its surface was stamped with unfamiliar symbols, Portuguese, she suspected, though she could not read them. The crate was nailed shut, but a faint scent of linseed oil and paint lingered, hinting at its contents. Miss Marple's heart quickened. She had seen such crates before, in a case years ago involving stolen art. Forged paintings, she suspected, or perhaps originals meant for illicit trade. The quarry, remote and forgotten, was an ideal hiding place, far from the prying eyes of Upper Chipping. She covered the crate again, careful not to disturb its surroundings, and rejoined Tommy, who was poking at a patch of nettles with a stick. "A fine spot for herbs," she said brightly, steering him back to the path before he could ask questions. Her mind, however, was racing, piecing together the quarry's role in Ellen's death and the activities of Ferreira and Mrs. Gray. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a discreet visit to Inspector Craddock, who was staying at the Blue Boar Inn while overseeing the murder investigation. She found him in the inn's parlour, poring over reports with a frown. Craddock, a young man with a respect for Miss Marple's insights, listened as she described the quarry's crate and its suspicious markings. "It's likely contraband," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Art perhaps smuggled or forged. Ellen may have seen something she shouldn't have." Craddock, though sceptical of village spinsters playing detective, agreed to send a constable to investigate. By evening, the crate had been opened, revealing a collection of paintings, landscapes and portraits, their brush strokes fresh, their signatures suspiciously familiar. Experts, Craddock later confirmed, would need to verify their authenticity, but the scent of forgery was unmistakable. The discovery sent ripples through Upper Chipping. At the village shop, Mrs. Price speculated wildly about buried treasure, while Mr. Giles, the historian, suggested the paintings were looted from some European gallery. Miss Marple, knitting in her parlour, dismissed these flights of fancy. The leather cases, she reasoned, held not paintings but documents, perhaps provenances, buyer lists or instructions tying the quarry's cash to a larger scheme. The question was, whose scheme? Ferreira's, with his secretive telegrams and sketches, or Mrs. Gray's, with her nervous glances and missing scarf? As dusk settled, Miss Marple learned of new developments. Mrs. Gray had announced her intention to leave Chipping Manor, citing the strain of recent events. Her sudden decision, shared with Mrs. Harmon over tea, raised eyebrows, for the manor's lease was paid for months in advance. Meanwhile, Ferreira was seen at the Blue Boar, his bags packed, his manner agitated. Miss Marple, hearing this from Mrs. Weatherby, felt a familiar prickle of urgency. The players in this drama, she sensed, were preparing to flee, and with them, the truth might vanish. That night, as she sat by her fire, Miss Marple turned over the clues in her mind. The quarry's crate, the letter's mention of Lisbon's orders, Ellen's red clay shoes, all pointed to a conspiracy that had cost a life. Ellen, she suspected, had stumbled upon the quarry's secret, perhaps witnessing a delivery or overhearing a plan. Her curiosity, as Mrs. Gray had hinted, had been her undoing. But who had tightened the scarf around her throat? Ferreira, with his guarded demeanour, or Mrs. Gray, whose composure masked a deeper fear? Or was there another, the man in the grey suit seen arguing with Ferreira, whose role remained a shadow? Miss Marple's needles paused as she gazed into the fire. Upper Chipping, with its quiet lanes and watchful eyes, was a stage where motives played out in subtle gestures and half-spoken truths. She would need to act swiftly, for the threads of this mystery were unravelling, and the quarry's secret was only the beginning. Chapter 6. The Confrontation. The village of Upper Chipping, though outwardly serene under the October sky, thrummed with a tension that Miss Jane Marple felt as keenly as a change in the wind. The discovery of the forged paintings in the quarry had sharpened the focus on Senor Antonio Ferreira and Mrs. Lavinia Gray, whose imminent departures suggested a desire to outrun the shadow of Ellen's murder. Miss Marple, her knitting a steady companion, knew that the truth, like a shy creature, required careful coaxing to emerge, With the players poised to scatter, she resolved to act before the threads of the mystery slipped through her fingers. Early that morning, Miss Marple learned from Mrs. Harmon that Ferreira had booked a ticket on the evening train to London. His agitation, noted by the innkeeper's wife, was palpable. He had been seen pacing the Blue Boar's garden, his leather case clutched tightly, his eyes scanning the horizon. Meanwhile, Mrs. Gray's preparations for departure were equally hurried. The temporary maid reported packing trunks and a flurry of telegrams sent from the manor. Miss Marple, sipping tea in her parlour, recognized the signs of flight. "People run when they feel the net closing," she murmured to herself, her needles clicking with purpose. She telephoned Inspector Craddock, who was now coordinating with county authorities on the quarry's findings. With her characteristic blend of diffidence and precision, she urged him to intercept Ferreira at the station. "He may not be our murderer, Inspector," she said, "but his case holds answers." Craddock, accustomed to her uncanny instincts, agreed to act. That afternoon, as the station clock ticked towards 6, he and a constable detained Ferreira on the platform. The Portuguese gentleman, his face a mask of controlled dismay, protested mildly as his leather case was opened under the curious gaze of a gathering crowd. Inside were no paintings, as some had speculated, but a collection of forged passports, each bearing a different name, but the same sallow face, and a ledger listing art dealers across Europe, their addresses meticulously noted alongside sums of money. Ferreira, cornered, admitted to his role in an art smuggling ring. "I move the goods, nothing more," he said, his accent thickening under pressure. "The paintings in the quarry, they were to be sold in London, then shipped abroad. I swear I did not kill the maid." When pressed about Ellen, he grew evasive, muttering only that she had seen too much at the manor. His sketches, he confessed, were not of escape routes, as Miss Marple had first thought, but of the manor's layout, meant to guide a buyer to the quarry's cache. Craddock, noting the ledger's details, took Ferreira into custody for questioning, though murder remained unproven. Miss Marple, informed of the arrest by a breathless Mrs. Weatherby, turned her attention to Mrs. Gray. The widow's sudden decision to leave Chipping Manor, coupled with her nervous reaction to the quarry, suggested a deeper involvement. Miss Marple, with a basket of apples as her pretext, made her way to the manor once more. The house was in disarray, trunks half-packed, curtains drawn. Mrs. Gray, caught off guard, received her in the study, where the leather case still sat, its presence a silent accusation. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Mrs. Gray said, her voice brittle. "This village, it's too much after poor Helen." Miss Marple, settling into a chair with her knitting, steered the conversation to Ellen's duties. "She must have been privy to your correspondence," she remarked, her tone mild. Mrs. Gray's hands trembled as she poured tea. "She was a maid, nothing more," she snapped, but her eyes betrayed panic. Miss Marple, undeterred, mentioned the quarry's paintings, watching as Mrs. Gray's cup clattered against its saucer. Sensing an opening, Miss Marple excused herself to the hall, ostensibly to fetch a dropped stitch, but instead slipped into the study's alcove. There, behind a panel she had noticed on her last visit, she found a hidden drawer. Inside was Ellen's diary, its pages filled with meticulous notes, dates, overheard conversations, and a chilling entry about a meeting at the quarry on the night of her death. The diary revealed Ellen's suspicion that Mrs. Gray was blackmailing Ferreira, using her knowledge of his smuggling to extort money. Miss Marple slipped the diary into her basket, her heart heavy. Ellen's curiosity had led her to the quarry, where she had likely confronted Mrs. Gray, demanding a share of the profits or threatening exposure. The scarf, Miss Marple now realized, was no stolen trinket, but a weapon of opportunity, used to silence a threat. She returned to the drawing room, her face serene, and took her leave, promising to send a recipe for apple chutney. Mrs. Gray's relief was palpable, but Miss Marple knew it would be short-lived. That evening, she shared the diary with Craddock, who read it with growing alarm. The entries, though not conclusive, pointed to Mrs. Gray as the mastermind of the smuggling operation, with Ferreira as her reluctant accomplice. Ellen's death, Miss Marple suggested, was the act of a woman cornered by her own greed. Craddock, marshalling his resources, prepared to confront Mrs. Gray, while Miss Marple, back in her cottage knitted by the fire, her mind already anticipating the final act of this somber drama. The truth, she knew, was close, but it would require one last push to bring it into the light. Chapter 7. The Unmasking. The final threads of the mystery in Upper Chipping were drawn tight as Miss Jane Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a quiet counterpoint to the storm brewing within her thoughts. Ellen's diary, now in Inspector Craddock's hands, had cast a stark light on Mrs. Lavinia Gray's role in the affair, transforming her from a reclusive widow into a figure of calculated deceit. Signor Antonio Ferreira's arrest had unravelled part of the tapestry, but it was Mrs. Gray, Miss Marple knew, who held the needle that had stitched this deadly pattern together. With the widow's departure imminent, time was slipping away, and Miss Marple's gentle persistence was about to meet its test. By morning, word reached Upper Chipping that Mrs. Gray had not boarded the early train as planned. Instead, a hurried message from the Manor's temporary maid revealed that Mrs. Gray had left in the night, her trunks loaded into a hired car bound for London. The village buzzed with speculation, but Miss Marple, sipping tea with her niece Florence, saw opportunity in the flight. "People who run, my dear," she said, her eyes bright behind her spectacles, "often leave their secrets behind." Florence, stirring her tea, sighed. "You make it sound like a game, Aunt Jane, but it's murder." Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. A game, perhaps, but one with rules, and those who break them are seldom as clever as they think. She telephoned Inspector Craddock, who was already mobilizing his men. Ellen's diary, with its damning entries, had given him cause to act swiftly. The final note, scribbled in haste, mentioned Mrs. Gray's plan to meet the contact at the quarry, a meeting Ellen had intended to witness. Armed with this, Craddock traced Mrs. Gray to a discreet boarding house in London's Bayswater district, where she had registered under a false name. Miss Marple, invited to join as a consultant, a role Craddock offered with a mix of respect and bemusement, travelled to London that afternoon. Her knitting bag a familiar companion, the boarding house, a narrow building with peeling paint, was far removed from the elegance of Chipping Manor. Mrs. Gray, confronted in her sparsely furnished room, maintained her composure at first, her dark eyes cold as she denied any wrongdoing. "I left Upper Chipping for my health," she said, her voice smooth but strained. "This business with Ellen has been too much. Craddock, holding the diary, read aloud its final entry. Mrs. G to meet contact at quarry, midnight. She thinks I don't know her game. Mrs. Gray's face paled, and her hands, once so steady, clutched the edge of a chair. Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner, spoke at last. "You were very clever, Mrs. Gray," she said, her tone as gentle as a lullaby. "The paintings, the quarry, the blackmail. It was all your design, wasn't it? Poor Ellen saw too much, and you couldn't risk her talking." Mrs. Gray's lips parted, but no words came. Craddock, taking the cue, pressed further, detailing the evidence, the forged paintings, Ferreira's ledger, and the diary's account of her extortion scheme. Cornered, Mrs. Gray's facade crumbled. "It was an accident," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Ellen demanded money, threatened to go to the police. I only meant to frighten her." The confession poured forth like a dam bursting. Mrs. Gray admitted to orchestrating the art smuggling ring, using Ferreira as a courier while she negotiated with buyers, including the mysterious man in the grey suit who had fled when Ellen's body was found. The scarf, she confessed, was not stolen but used in a moment of panic when Ellen confronted her at the quarry, demanding a share of the profits. "She wouldn't stop," Mrs. Gray said, her eyes distant. "I grabbed the scarf from my pocket. I didn't mean to kill her." The room fell silent, save for the faint clink of Miss Marple's needles, a sound as steady as her resolve. Craddock arrested Mrs. Gray, who was led away, her elegance replaced by a hollow resignation. Ferreira, though guilty of smuggling, was cleared of murder. His sketches and telegrams explained as desperate attempts to appease Mrs. Gray's demands. The man in the grey suit, identified as a minor art dealer from Lisbon, remained at large. But the case for upper chipping was closed. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat with Florence, the fire casting soft shadows on the walls. "It's always the small things," she said, her needles pausing. "A scarf, a diary, a bit of clay. They tell the story if you listen." Florence, shaking her head, marvelled at her aunt's insight. "You make it sound so simple, Aunt Jane." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Human nature is simple, my dear. It's only the secrets we keep that make it seem otherwise." Upper Chipping settled back into its quiet ways, the manor's lights dimming once more. The stranger from Lisbon was gone, and Mrs. Gray's name faded into whispers. But Miss Marple, knitting by her window, knew that the village, like all places where hearts beat and secrets stirred, would never be entirely free of shadows.